And the last speaker in our session is Alexander Soetaert. He's a book historian. He's written a PhD dissertation about book production and trade in the Walloon provinces, and he has written a number of articles about it too. He did it at the Catholic University of Leuven, and he's editing his dissertation now as a book, which will hopefully soon be available. And from now on, he's going to capture the world. He's moving for the next 2 months to the Amsterdam Center for History and the Heritage of Protestantism. And from the 1st of January 2019 onwards, you can meet him as a postdoctoral fellow at the Leibniz Institute für Europäische Geschichte in Mainz. He's going to speak to us about the competition between Munich, Cologne, Antwerp and Douai in reprinting the successful Jesuit author Jeremias Drexel.
Many of you will already have encountered the name of Jeremias Drexel. It is often stated that the Bavarian Jesuit was the most published author of the early or even the whole 17th century. In the Neue Deutsche Biographie, for instance, we read that he was the most significant ascetic writer of Germany in the 17th century. But already in his own time, Drexel was famous as one of the best-selling authors. One of his Munich publishers, Cornelius Leyser, estimated that between 1620 and 1639, he and his fellow Munich publishers had issued close to 160,000 copies of the Jesuits' work. 3 years later, another 12,000 copies had been printed. In addition, most of Drexel's works were frequently reprinted across Europe. The figures for Munich does represent only a small share of the total number of books produced. I first encountered Drexel's name while compiling a database of Catholic editions printed in Douai, a university town in the south of the Habsburg Low Countries and one of its major typographic centers during the first half of the 17th century. At first, I gave a deep sigh while creating the obtained record for a Drexel book. But after a while, I started to realize that the Drexel books were not only an illustration of Douai's flourishing printing business, but also give insight into the functioning of the European book market in the early 17th century. More specifically, they tell a lot about the processes of reprinting, which were omnipresent in the book business in this period, and the ways in which publishers positioned their editions in a highly competitive market. Jeremias Drexel was born in 1581 to Lutheran parents in the bi-confessional town of Augsburg, also in Bavaria. Yet he converted to Catholicism, studied with the Jesuits, and finally entered their order in 1598. In 1615, he was appointed as a preacher at the ducal court of Bavaria, where he also became the personal confessor of Duke Maximilian I. Many of Drexel's books indeed result from his activities as a preacher. He often reworked his German-language sermons into a Latin text, which was then published and often also retranslated into German by others. In a way, not unlike the contemporary French bishops François de Sales and Jean-Pierre Camus, also very popular preachers and authors, he tried to make theological and spiritual concepts more tangible and comprehensible, irrespective of the intellectual backgrounds of his listeners and readers. Drexel's most favorite topics were death, heaven, and hell. The Jesuit considered it his duty to point the faithful to their spiritual responsibilities, such as regularly making their confession or fasting, and to stimulate them to spiritual self-scrutiny. In a sense, Drexel successfully transferred the hell sermon from the pulpit to the paper. Yet among his writings we also find the Orbis Phaeton, a multi-volume work on the vices of the tongue, for which Drexel not only used Christian but also classical sources. According to James Latham, this work was more didactic than devotional, since, I cite, it called attention to the dangers inherent in an unbridled tongue and the moral consequences that follow. End of citation. Since Drexel published a book almost every year between 1618 and his death in 1638, it was impossible to investigate the editorial history of all of his works. So I decided to select 5 titles, of which the Moritz Sabelliary of the Faculty of Theology and Religious Studies at the University of Leuven holds copies of many different editions. First, the Recta Intentio, published in 1626, second Heliotropium, first published in 1627, then Aeternitatis Prodromus, published in 1628, for the Gymnasium Patientia, 1630, and finally Infernus Damnatorum of 1631. The library collections include rare books from Belgium as well as the Dutch Jesuits, and in total the library preserves over 330 copies of over 30 different Drexel titles published before 1700, and this is just an estimated number. Most of these copies, however, date from the 1620s and the 1630s. The collection not only includes copies of the original Munich editions, but also those of reprints in Douai, Cologne, and Antwerp, which enabled me to compare these various issues in one single library. Let us first have a look at the publishers involved in printing Drexel books. All first editions of Drexel's work, the original Latin texts as well as the German translations, came off the press in Munich. His first publications, Zodiacus Christianus, De Aeternitate Considerationis, and Horologium Auxiliaris, were issued by the ducal engraver Raphael Zadler in collaboration with the printers Nicolaus Heinrich and Anna Berg, widow of Adam Berg. In 1624 and 1625, Heinrich published some Drexel titles alone, yet from those years on, Berg, Heinrich, and the new printer Cornelius Leyser decided to collaborate. Leyser was born in the Low Countries but came to Munich in the early 1620s. Some years later, he took over the business of the deceased printer Herzroy and married his widow. He almost immediately obtained recognition as Kurfürstlicher Buchdrucker und Buchhandler, that is court printer to Duke Elector Maximilian I. This, of course, explains why Drexel, the court confessor and preacher, would mostly turn to Leyser in the upcoming years. Although not all Drexel editions have Leyser's name in their imprint, he clearly coordinated a printing consortium with Berg and Heinrich. In a preface to a posthumous edition, Drexel edition in 1639, the publisher commented elaborately upon the enormous number of Drexel books produced over the past 2 decades. According to Leyser, he possessed all manuscripts already published, as well as 8 more texts which had yet to be printed. He started to issue these gradually from 1639 on, but his own death, 4 years later, prevented him from completing this task. The first edition of a new Drexel title, he also explained, was mostly printed in duodecimo, while a second edition would be printed in vicesimo quarto. In addition, Leyser provides an overview of all the Munich print runs of Drexel books, including the number of copies produced. It appears that Leyser himself published over 60% of the total of 158,700 copies, while the shares of Heinrich and the widow Berg accounted for 31% and 9% respectively. In fact, to meet the high demand for Drexel editions, there was probably no other option for the Munich publishers than to collaborate. The Munich printers generally disposed of an imperial printing privilege, which theoretically protected their editions within the empire's borders. Yet, almost all Drexel books were swiftly reprinted in Cologne, the empire's most prolific Catholic typographic center. Most of these reprints were issued by Peter Henning, a printer of whom little is known. Yet the VD 17 catalogue shows that he specialized in Latin editions of religious works, mainly in translations from the Spanish, Italian, and French. In the mid-1620s, he also started reprinting the Latin titles of the Bavarian Jesuits. His first editions were 2 older books, Zodiacus Christianus and De Aeternitate Considerationis, from 1626 onward. However, his reprints followed the Munich editions more closely. Generally, he reprinted the book within 1 or 2 years, and in some cases even within one and the same year. For specific editions, he appears to have collaborated with other publishers in Cologne, namely Bernhard Walter, Heinrich Kraft, Johann Nikolaus Zeck, and Peter Hilden. In total, between the years 1625 and 1634, Henning issued 13 editions of 12 different Drexel titles. The most productive production center for Drexel books, next to Munich, appears to have been the already mentioned university town of Douai, located in the francophone provinces of the Habsburg Low Countries. The Bavarian Jesuit was among the 3 most published authors there, the other 2 being the French bishops François de Sales and Jean-Pierre Camus. Since the opening of the university in the early 1560s, Douai had become a major center for Catholic printing. Moreover, the local Jesuit college was one of the largest of the Low Countries, making Douai likewise a center for the Jesuit order. Against this background, no less than 28 editions of 14 different Drexel titles came off the press in Douai between 1622 and 1637. These were all reprints of the original Latin editions, and except one, all published by Balthazar Belair, a son of an Antwerp printer who settled in Douai in the early 1590s, and whose publishing house swiftly became the most productive in town. Belair usually succeeded in reprinting Drexel books within 1 or 2 years after the first editions in Munich. Eternitatis Prodromus and Infernus Damnatorum even came off the press the same year as in the Bavarian capital. Belair also was among the first to provide an edition of the collected works of Drexel in 1636. This 2-volume edition, counting over 1,500 pages, encompassed 12 different texts by Drexel, 11 of which Belair had already printed over the previous years. Belair died in 1639, 1 year following Drexel, but he already stopped printing the Jesuits' books some years earlier. The appearance of a new player in the market for Drexel books may explain why. This is the printing office of Belair in Douai, next to the main building of the university. In 1631, also the Antwerp printer Jan Knobbart, who worked next to the headquarters of the Antwerp Jesuits, started reprinting Drexel's books. His first Drexel edition, Infernus Damnatorum, was a shared one with Belair. In the following years, he also published Rosae Selectissimarum and Rhetorica Caelestis. Both were probably also shared editions, but I have not yet found a copy of the Belair imprints to verify this hypothesis. In any case, while Belair was always granted a printing privilege by the provincial of the Leuven Jesuit province, that is, the province for the French-speaking regions of the Low Countries, during the 1630s, Knobbart was granted privileges for several Drexel texts by the provincial of the Flemish Jesuit province, covering the Dutch-speaking north of the Habsburg Low Countries, as well as by the Privy Council in Brussels. And the latter privileges were valid for the whole of the Habsburg territories in the Low Countries and, as such, prevented Belair from issuing Drexel books without Knobbart's consent. By consequence, for one title included in the collected works of 1636, Belair was forced to ask permission to the Antwerp printer. In contrast to Belair, who only reprinted the Latin text Knobbart, and from 1638 onward, his widow also issued Dutch-language translations of most of Drexel's books. One final publisher of Drexel reprints remains to be mentioned. Some 28 editions or states of 11 different Drexel titles bear the imprint of Cornelius ab Egmont, a Cologne publisher who originated from the Low Countries and was trained at the Officina Plantiniana. Investigation of the typographical initials and ornaments used in these editions, however, has suggested, and for some books even demonstrated, that these were printed in the workshop of Willem Blow in Amsterdam. Although he was raised a Mennonite and during his life showed increasing sympathy to the Remonstrants, Blow also recognized the high commercial potential of books of Catholic authors, including Jeremias Drexel. Already in the mid-1620s, the Amsterdam City Council had reprimanded him for the printing of Catholic books. This no doubt explains why he decided to issue new Catholic editions under the imprint of the Cologne publisher Egmont. The precise role played by Egmont is unclear, but he may have helped to distribute copies across Catholic lands, for instance through the Frankfurt Book Fair. It is thought that Blow's editions were indeed destined for export, yet it should also be taken into account that the Dutch Republic itself counted a large number of Catholic faithful who might have been interested in Drexel books. The Egmont imprints were all issued between 1630 and 1635. This contrasts with the activities of Henning in Cologne, who started reprinting Drexel in 1625, 5 years earlier, and those of Belair in Douai, who started already 3 years earlier than Henning, so in 1622. Henning and Belair also continued reprinting Drexel titles for 9 and 14 years respectively, and their reprints more swiftly followed the Munich editions. Blow's editions might have been different than just providing a reprint as quickly as possible. It thus appears that during the 1620s and 1630s, at least 6 publishers operating from Munich, Douai, Cologne, Antwerp, and Amsterdam tried to make profits by printing and reprinting the works of the immensely popular Jesuit writer Jeremias Drexel. But how did they position their editions within this highly competitive market? What strategies did they use to make their particular edition the most attractive for a particular readership? Putting the different copies held by the Moritz Sabo Library in Leuven next to one another helps to discover several differences between the editions. When issuing a new Drexel book, Leyser and his Munich companions always opted for a duodecimo. In the already cited 1639 preface, however, Leyser stated that for the second edition he generally chose for a vicesimo quarto format, which was, I cite, light to carry wherever one desires, end of citation. Yet for the 5 titles investigated, I only traced one such edition for Gymnasium Patientiae, which was indeed published in the same year as the book's first edition. In Cologne, Peter Henning decided not to change the format of the original editions. His reprints were thus always issued in duodecimo. By contrast, both Belair and Blow prefer to issue their reprints in sextodecimo or in vicesimo quarto. There are no Latin Drexel editions known to be printed in formats larger than duodecimo, yet the 2 earliest editions of the collected works, published by Segen and Heinrich in Munich in 1628 and by Belair in Douai in 1636, were printed in quarto. These editions might have been developed for readers or institutions who at once wanted to acquire all the works of the Bavarian Jesuit. Drexel books thus circulated in different sizes, which enabled their use in different circumstances, at home, on the road, or in institutional libraries. Inside the Drexel editions, there are notable differences regarding the typesetting. The first Munich editions were always set up in relatively large characters with a height of 1.5 to 2 millimeters. The pages of these editions usually count 26 to 30 lines. The reprints by Henning, published in the same format, were strikingly similar. The characters likewise measure up to 2 millimeters and pages consisted of 26 or 27 lines. The characters used by Belair by contrast were no higher than 1 millimeter. He always printed in either sextodecimo or vicesimo quarto, so his pages were considerably smaller than those of the Munich and Cologne editions. Yet they consistently counted 32 lines. There's also less spacing between the lines. Finally, the reprints assumed to be printed in the Blow workshop were set up in characters of the same size as Belair's. The pages count 31 to 36 lines. Some pictures immediately illustrate how these choices resulted in a different outlook of the books, but also in a different body text. The choices regarding bibliographical format, character size, and the number of lines per page quite naturally determined the amount of paper needed for one single copy. Depending on the text's length, the Munich and Cologne editions usually consisted of 20 to 25 sheets of paper. The number of sheets used for the editions by Belair and Blow, on the other hand, varies between 8 for the shorter and 16.5 for the longest text. The Douai and Amsterdam publishers thus significantly reduced the number of sheets. They managed to print the very same text with only 2/3 or even half of the paper of the Munich editions. Of course, using smaller characters or setting up more lines per page also reduced the quality and readability of the text. Especially the Belair editions give the impression to be of lower quality. Yet less paper most likely also meant a lower book price, and we know that even the Munich publishers acknowledged the need for cheaper Drexel editions. Another aspect of Drexel's large success was the fact that his books were affordable for a relatively wide readership, not only for wealthy institutions or the more prosperous readers. On the other hand, since the reprints mostly concerned the Latin text, one should still bear in mind that they were most directly aimed at a Catholic intellectual elite. One final element also contributing to the popularity of Drexel remains to be dealt with: the engravings. According to Peter Daly, 10 books by the Bavarian Jesuit should be considered as emblematic titles. It strikes that precisely these were frequently reprinted in Douai, Cologne, and Amsterdam. For Drexel, engravings were essential. They were a means to support the message he wanted to convey to his readers. The emblems supported his intention to make theological and spiritual concepts more real and more easily understandable. In Munich, new Drexel titles were mostly issued with an engraved title page and varying numbers of engravings: 5 in Heliotropium, 3 in Eternitatis Prodromus and Gymnasium Patientiae, and 9 in Infernus Damnatorum. These engravings were all cut by members of the Zadler family, and especially by the court engraver Raphael Zadler, who also issued some of Drexel's earliest books. The fact that the engravings were such an essential part of Drexel's publications confronted publishers willing to issue a reprint with an additional challenge. It was indeed impossible to reuse the plates cut by Sadler for the Munich publishers. So if a reprint was to include the engravings, new ones had to be ordered from local engravers. It was no doubt for this reason that Peter Henning decided to issue most of his reprints without the engravings. As such, his editions were printed in the same bibliographical format and a similar character size as those in Munich, but without the illustrations. Belair and Blow chose to include all illustrations in their reprints. Belair ordered new engravings from Martin Baas, a local engraver in Douai. The iconography of his designs is clearly based on the Munich originals, yet the plates were executed with much less skill and detail. The letters linking the representation of the emblem to the passages in Drexel's text also lacked. The engravings included in the Egmont reprint are of considerably better quality. They are more detailed than those printed in Douai and include the letters referring to the text. Both Belair and Blow clearly understood the importance of illustrations for Drexel's books and thus took big efforts to issue their reprints with the engravings. It strikes that Belair was able to do this within a very short amount of time. His reprints of Aeternitatis Prodromus and Infernus Damnatorum were issued within the same year as the original Munich edition and still included 3 and 9 engravings respectively. These preliminary research results show that the publishers involved in printing and reprinting Drexel titles all developed their own strategy in order to cover the different segments of the market for the Jesuits' books. The Munich publishers of the Editiones Principes first opted for duodecimo editions with relatively large characters, but for a second print run often chose for smaller characters and vigésimo quarto. In Cologne, Peter Henning clearly imitated the first Munich editions, yet decided to leave out the engravings, as such reducing a crucial aspect of the attraction of Drexel's books. Balthazar Belair in Douai, who quite unexpectedly appears as the most prolific publisher of Drexel books next to the consortium of Munich publishers, opted for cheap pocket versions, characterized by small bibliographical formats and character sizes. Yet he never left out the engraved title pages or the engravings. The editions attributed to Blow then adopted a middle course, since they were printed in smaller formats than those in Munich, but were still of better quality than those in Douai. For reasons of time, I did not analyze the contribution of the Knobbart family in Antwerp, which in the second half of the 1630s became the largest publishers of Drexel reprints. Yet it appears that they most often produced both the duodecimo and vigésimo quarto editions of one and the same title. In conclusion, I think that next to the general interest in the themes Drexel dealt with, the accessibility of his style and the emblems included in his books, also the dynamics of printing and reprinting, so typical for the 17th century European book business, explain why his books could reach such an extraordinary popularity. Yet, since I'm still at the beginning of my investigations of the market for Drexel books, I would be very happy to hear your comments and suggestions. Thank you.